welcome to Sig Slayers, the comic signature show, period. I'm Mike the Sig Slayer, chilling with Mark. What up, fam?
What's up, Mike? This is going to be the best one yet.
Indeed. Joining us today is one of the coolest guys in all of nerddom, Marc Bernardin. But before we chop it up with Mark, though, please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and please comment. All right. Our next guest is excellence personified. Saying this man is a writer is an understatement. He is a film editor for the LA Times. He has written for damn near every major magazine and publication. He has written TV shows like Castle Rock, Treadstone, and Carnival Row. But here on Sig Slayers, we talk about comics, and he does that too. The current writer of Mace Windu, former writer on Static Shock, JLA, and X-Men Origins. You may also know him for the legendary podcast with Kevin Smith, Batman Beyond. Ladies and gentlemen of the Stash Land, we bring to you the one and only Marc Bernardin. What up, fam? How you doing?
I'm doing good. Thank you. That is the kindest intro I've gotten in a long while. I appreciate it. Like a blanket coming out of the dryer. I appreciate that.
I love it, man. Yes. Then my mission was complete. Well, thank you for joining us, Mark. We're going to dive right on in. We like to get started with our guests, especially their first timers, with their comic book origin story. You write across so many different mediums and genre, but you also in the comics. So I want to start with a different origin story. I want to find out how you got into comics as a fan, and what was the comic book community like back then in your neighborhood, if you know what I mean.
I got into comics, I'm not going to say it's by accident, because it was like my dad, when he would come home from work, he would take the train into Manhattan, and then, because we were living on Long Island at the time, and he'd get off the train and there was a comic book store right next to the train station. So every now and again he would pass through and he would pick up a thing. And mostly for him. I don't even think it was for me. I think it was, mostly for him. But he put, like, one day he goes and he brings me this bag that has a Savage Sword of Conan comic book in it. Back when Marvel used to do the black and white, like the oversized black and white anthologies, so like 3 short stories in every issue. They were not up to any comic code. Like, there was nudity and violence and sex and beheadings and all of it. And I'm like 11 and probably should not have been reading that comic book. But I was like, yo, if they're doing this in comic books, I need more comic books. And then so I went to that comic book store. It's called The Incredible Pulp in Baldwin, Long Island. Doesn't exist anymore. I imagine everybody who tells you this was my growing up comic book store, it ain't there anymore. But I went in there and I found, I think it was Secret Wars. It was Secret Wars number 6 or 7, whichever one. If you know the Secret Wars, the original Secret Wars run, there's an issue, the cover is the Hulk, like holding up a mountain. And it's like there are 150 million tons on top, pressing down on the Hulk. And he's angry or something like that. Whatever that comic book, prose was. I was like, I got to see what this is all about. And like, he's holding it up, and every major character, Spider-Man, Captain America, like the X-Men, they're all underneath it, and the Hulk is saving their lives with that, holding up that mountain. I was like, I got to know what's happening. And so I then became a Secret Wars reader, and Secret Wars did what it was designed to do, which is introduce you to the Marvel Universe, to give you a little bit of every character they cared about all at once. In 12 issues, you got it was the Vegas buffet of comics, right?
Right.
And then that was the beginning. That was it. Like, then I became an X-Men fan. I became a Spider-Man fan. I would then make my way slowly over to DC, like right when like the Dark Knight Returns was coming out. Like, oh, hey, this looks kind of dope, man. I like this Frank Miller guy because I read some of his Daredevil stuff, and this is cool. Right. And like the OG Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was happening at that time. Like Spawn was launching it. Like, it was the weird beginnings of what was going to be indie comics, plus some of the best superhero books that Marvel and DC would ever publish.
Did you have homies? Because like Mark and I, we met at a comic book shop, and we just hung tough. Did you run into any kindred spirits along the way?
No, like it was,
Figured
it was
that was the
always
case.
it was always a question of like finding a person that you knew in another sort of regard and discovering they also read comics. Like there was a dude in my like drafting class in high school who was, like I saw like a little drawing he had of like the Spawn logo. And I was like, oh, all right, I see you. I see what that's happening. And so then we would like, I'd ride my bike to his house. We'd ride our bikes to the comic book store together. But like, we would never talk about it in other, we would
I
be
told you, Mark.
in mutual and group conversation. Like we would never have like, hey man, so, Hulk versus Thor, who you think wins? Hey, is adamantium, like, do you think that like Superman could bend Wolverine's claws? Like, what you think? That was never a public topic of conversation.
Okay,
Never.
just out of curiosity, what did you think would happen if you publicly had that discussion?
Like this would have been like 1986, 87. And nobody was ready to have that conversation. Like that becomes, you're in a teen movie, right? You're in a like, oh, you're a nerd. And you'd be like sat in the wrong, table in the lunchroom. They'd be looking at you funny walking down the halls. Like it's every cliche that you can imagine. It was, and all those cliches were true at the time. It's like, yeah, the comic book store was like the android's dungeon on The Simpsons. Like, no girls allowed. We don't have time. Don't come in here with your greasy fingers and you're going to mess up my pristine issue 14 of this. But like, it was never a welcoming community until eventually it became a welcoming community. The dividing line was Tim Burton's Batman. Like, if you were a nerd before that, you kept that shit tight. Like, you didn't tell anybody. If you were a nerd after that, it's like, oh, you like Batman? I got a t-shirt too. Everybody has one. You're not special, Janice.
So when did you pick up writing, and what was because you write across different formats, what format did you pick up first?
The first thing that I wrote that I ever showed anybody was I was going to make a comic book with some friends in like high school. A couple guys in art class, we were going to do a comic book. And I thought I was going to draw it, and then I discovered that I couldn't draw. Like that was a bad day in the Mark household when I was like, oh man, I'm not any good at this. I always thought I'd be, but well, all right, but I guess I can write the thing, I suppose. And like, so created the character. We never made a comic book. Like there's one drawing that somebody has, I don't. And then it was like college, and I was trying to. I went to school in New York at a school that did not have a film program. They had like a communication arts was the closest you could get, which was mostly TV. Because in New York at this particular school, like I wanted to go to NYU and be Spike Lee, but I couldn't afford NYU or get into NYU. And so I ended up at St. John's, and St. John's pumps out like cameramen and editors for local TV news and sports. Like that's what they do. So like every New York station locally has a bunch of St. John's graduates working in the control room and, chopping up tape and all that. That was their focus. But I'm like, I don't want to, like, that's not popping my cork. And I don't know, like I kind of I like Star Trek and I like Twilight Zone and I like TV, I think. I like movies. I don't want to, but there was a competition, a writing for television competition that one of my professors pointed out. And he's like, you should enter that. Yeah, all right, what do I have to do? It's like, you have to write an episode of a TV show that you like, that already exists. I was like, I can do that. And I wrote an episode of Star Trek. And like, that was the first thing. It was like Next Generation at the time. So I wrote an episode of Next Generation. I entered this contest. But it was the proof of concept of like, you can do this. It's not impossible to do. It was harder at the time in 1992 to find out what TV script looked like. There's no internet in 1992. Like I had to truck my ass down to like Washington Square Park in the city and like find the Nigerian selling scripts on the corner. And I was like, all right, I'll buy that for $10. I'll buy the script for Raiders of the Lost Ark for $10. I'll buy Aliens for $10. And then what else you got? And then I found
they were selling scripts on the street.
That's what they did, man. Like outside of a film school. Like we got your fake Rolexes, we got your fake Fendi bags, we have a bunch of screenplays, film students that we know you're going to want to buy.
You just cemented your OG status, man, in the blurred community, man. Your first thing was a Star Trek script was the first thing you ever wrote? Man,
Yeah.
you like the Don, bro. You like the Don.
How has your time as a journalist structured your research on a subject?
I mean, journalism, I mean, also, like, I always refer to this, and I feel bad to my other, like, entertainment journalist colleagues, but I'm like, I was barely a journalist. Like, entertainment journalism is not like political reporting. Like, I wasn't doing ride-alongs with police officers investigating corruption. I was not sitting in on city hall meetings, like, looking at political shenanigans. I was not changing people's lives with the work I was doing. It's like, oh, there's movies coming out. Let's talk about movies that are coming out. Let's tell you the movies that are coming out. Like, oh, this movie, like, it's kind of barely journalism. But what I'll say is that journalism taught me a healthy respect for the facts and the ways to go find those facts. And it's definitely more journalism than writing, but the idea that, you know, understanding how to source things, understanding how to research things, understanding, you know, how to assemble all of the research you found into a story that can convince a person to do a thing. It taught me speed. You know, journalism does not wait for anybody. Like, I worked for weekly magazines, I worked for daily newspapers, and I worked for the internet. And like, there's no time to like, I gotta make this just right. It's like, yo, this is going to press tonight. It's good enough. Like, can your good enough be great? And that's the discipline of being a journalist. You know, and it taught me how to work with people. You know, and I think that being in this business, you know, even if you're a writer who just writes by themselves, at some point you need to interface with other grown-ups, and you need to know how to talk to them. You know, in some degrees you need to manage them. In some places you need, you know, data from them. But you need to understand how team dynamics work. You need to understand how people work. You know, especially entertainment journalism, where some of the egos and the personalities are big and have needs that you're not used to having to meet in order to get the information that you want. Like, it's also a little bit of a con man. Like, how do I convince this person to tell me things they don't want to tell me, knowing full well that I'm going to tell the world what they told me? Like, how do I get the good thing? How do I get a little bit of juice? You know, and I think that because journalism, especially the kind of journalism that I did, was about watching movies and talking to people, you know, and watching TV shows. The more you watch, the more, the better you are at understanding how the things you're watching work. You know, like, that is how I ultimately taught myself how to write, is that I would watch movies that I loved, go to that Nigerian outside Washington Square Park and buy the script for that thing, and then watch them and look at them. It's like, all right, well, here's the script for Aliens, and here's Aliens. How does what he wrote translate into what I'm seeing? How does that get me that? You know, what's happening on the page that's eliciting this kind of emotional response? You know, and just doing that a lot, watching that a lot, you know. And I was lucky in that I am of the first generation that has repeated access to the medium that I love. You know, my parents had never seen a movie twice because you couldn't. You know, like, if you went to go see, you know, In the Heat of the Night, you saw The Heat of the Night and you never saw it again because there was no video, there was no streaming, there was like, it was never rerunning on TV. Like, it was a moment in time that came and went. But I had video, like I had VHS, then DVD, then Laserdisc and whatever, and I could watch, you know, Hunt for Red October 40 times if I wanted to, and figure out how each moment worked and break it down. Like, it was the do-it-yourself cheap man's film school of like, here's the stuff that I love, here's the stuff I'd like to make. How do they do that? I'm gonna just take it apart and try to put it back together again. You know, and so all of that, like the journalism plus the obsessiveness plus the access, all kind of coalesced at some point into a person who thought he could write things.
Was it always a goal to eventually to transition into comics professionally because you were a fan as a kid?
Yeah. I mean, and comics, it somehow felt more approachable than movies and TV did. Some of it was because comics were published in New York, and I grew up in New York, and I lived in New York, and so like I could walk by the DC Comics building or the Marvel building and knowing, oh, they're just doing it in there. Like, I was 3,000 miles away from where they made movies and TV shows, so it always felt, you know, distant and hard to get to. My first job out of college was, I was an intern and then was hired by a magazine called Starlog Magazine, which doesn't exist anymore. But back in the day, it and its sister publication, Fangoria, were like, if you were a nerd who loved nerd stuff, this was the only place to get information on it. It was like Starlog and maybe Famous Monsters of Filmland, Fangoria, and that was it. Like, no internet. Like, how am I going to see pictures of how they made Evil Dead 2? How am I going to see beauty shots of the Enterprise? How am I going to get, interviews with, George Lucas and Spielberg and Carpenter and all those guys? Those magazines were the only places to do it. And what invariably ended up happening was employees, editors there would, after doing 2 or 3 years at Starlog, would get hired by DC to go be editors at DC. And I was like, awesome, this is my path, right? Like, that person worked there, left DC. That person left, went to DC. I'm like, where's my time? I'm gonna go work for DC. And it didn't happen. And I was like heartbroken. I was like, guys, I was in the pipe. Like, I was ready to go. Like, and I ended up at Entertainment Weekly instead. But because they were all at DC, like, they would invite me up to DC. It's like, you should come for lunch. You can come and walk around, come and steal stuff from the inventory closet. You'd walk into this closet. It was like every trade paperback they'd ever published. You'd like, take what you want. I take what I want. Take what you can carry. Okay, I can carry a lot. But because I suddenly knew people who made comics, it didn't feel so far away. When I got to Entertainment Weekly, in the same way that Batman was this dividing line between people who were nerds privately and nerds publicly, I think Spider-Man was this dividing line between an industry that took comic books seriously and didn't. And when Spider-Man comes out in 2002, 2003, I think it is, and makes $500 million, suddenly became a thing nobody could ignore. You could kind of ignore the X-Men, which did okay. You could kind of ignore Blade, which was, never quite gets the credit it deserves for being the first real, the second gen of comic book movies. There's just Superman's in the 70s, and then Blade is the beginning of where we are now. But when Spider-Man comes out, I could then go to my bosses and be like, hey, it seems like lots of people like comic books. We should cover comic books, right? And he's like, all right, once a month, we'll do a couple pages in the back of Entertainment Weekly covering comics. And I was like, dope. Can I go to San Diego Comic-Con and meet people who make comics? They're like, sure, we'll pay for that because we're a magazine in the 90s and in the early 2000s where there's money. And so, yeah, they sent me to Comic-Con, and I would just meet artists. I'd meet editors. I'd meet writers. I'd meet the people who made comics. And, after a couple of years of doing that, they'd say hey, you're a decent writer. Clearly you can hit a deadline. Do you ever think about writing comic books? And I'd say, you have no idea how long I've thought about writing comic books. Yes, I've thought about writing comic books. Like, well, pitch me something. And that was my beginning of trying to do that thing that I loved for a living.
Man, we got both origin stories in the first 5 questions. All right, begs the next question. Tell us how you met Kevin Smith and how did that relationship blossom into the phenomenon that is Fat Man Beyond, formerly Fat Man on Bat.
I met Kevin, I was at Entertainment Weekly, and I was an editor at the time. And I think it wasn't Zack and Miri. I can't remember what movie it was for. It might have been Jersey Girl. But at any rate, I wanted to do a filmography. And I was like, hey, this dude's got a body of work. He's got a new movie coming out. Let's just get him on the phone and go through his movies and have me tell me anecdotes about them. So I reached out to his publicist who gave me his information. Kev was like, sure, the Entertainment Weekly, that'd be a fool to say no to Entertainment Weekly. So I email him. I'm like, hey, I'd love to do this. He's like, hey, do you mind if we do this on instant message? I'd much rather write than talk. This was, I think, just before he became a world-class raconteur who'd go on tour and talk for hours and hours and hours about stuff. But I was like, yeah, all right, sure, here's my instant message. And, and so he pops up on my IM and we just do the thing, typing back and forth. I don't have to transcribe an interview. He gets to type instead of talk. It's all good. But then he would pop up on my instant message every now and again. He'd be like, hey, did you see the Hulk? I'd be like, yeah, man, that was weird, right? He's like, what happened there? He's like, hey, man, do we use a colon or a semicolon for this sentence? And I was like, you're a professional person who works with words. You must know punctuation and shit. I'm like, well, all right. And so that would be every couple of weeks, he'd pop up on my instant message with just a thing. Then he'd be like, "Hey, do you play poker?" And I was like, "Well, I have in the past. I'm not great at it." He said, "Well, I have a poker game in New Jersey at my comic book store that we do once a month. You should come down." I was like, "Well, I lived in New Jersey at the time. It was 15 minutes away from my house." I'm like, "Yeah, I'll roll through." So that was the first time I met him in person, was playing poker with him. And 30 other guys who drove from the entirety of the Eastern Seaboard to come and play poker with Kevin on like a Wednesday night in Red Bank, New Jersey. So one dude from like Maine drove down and was driving back. Another dude from like Alabama drove up. Like guys from everywhere would just commute, like, you know, pilgrimage to come and play poker with Kevin, New Jersey. And so that was the first time we met. He came back to shoot Cop Out, and he invited me to the set for Cop Out. And he was like, "You're in town, you should come." Like, "All right, man, that's cool. I'll hang out with you until 4 o'clock in the morning on the set of your Bruce Willis movie. Why would I not do that?" I went out to LA for about 3 or 4 months to work on my first TV show on Alphas. And he was like, "Oh, you're in LA. You should. I got a morning show podcast that I do with my wife. You should come and be a guest on the morning show." I was like, "Yeah, all right, sure, I'll come on +1 with Jen and Kev." He's like, "That was fun. I got this Batman podcast. You should be a guest on the Batman podcast." I'm like, "Sure." He's like, "Think of like your 10 best Batman moments, and we'll talk about it." I was like, "All right." Then he said, "Oh no, wait. There's a new Dark Knight Returns animated movie coming out. Why don't you watch that, and then we'll kind of review it on the podcast." Like, all right, dope. So I show up at his house, and we're, you know, going through it. And he's like, "Oh man, that was fun. We should do a commentary track for Batman movies. Which one should we do?" So we'll do 89 Batman. It's like, all right, great. And then that went well. And then we kept doing those for a while. Then we got up to like Batman Begins, and we're like, well, it's not as much fun when it's a good movie. Like, it was way more fun when they were bad. But you just come on the podcast. Like, it'll be cool. We'll just talk about some stuff. And then we did that, and then he's like, "Hey, do you want to be the co-host of this thing?" It's like, "Yeah, I mean, what do I have to do?" It's like, "Nothing, just show up." I'm like, "All right, bet." He's like, "Hey man, should we put up some cameras in here?" I was like, "I don't know, we'll stream it onto YouTube maybe." It's like, "Okay." It's like, "Hey man, our producer just opened up a bar. Should we like make that our like steady residency at Scum and Villainy?" He's like, "Sure." "Hey man, do you want to go on the road? Like, we can book some dates if you want." Okay. You know, the entirety of my relationship with Kevin has been Kevin saying, "Hey man, do you wanna?" And I say, "Yes, Kevin, I do." Whatever awesome. It is. "Hey man, do you want to write He-Man?" "Sure, I can write an episode of He-Man for you." It's like, "Hey man."
What could you tell us about Eyes of Wakanda?
Nothing.
As we expected. Disney.
Because I would like to at some point work for them again. And if I'm the dude who's like, "You know what? Let me tell you what happens in episodes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 of Eyes of Wakanda," that won't happen. I mean, what I will tell you is that getting to work with Marvel Animation, like, those people are just so friggin' smart and so committed to things being good. You know, like I haven't worked with any other part of Marvel really, except for the animation team. But the amount of rigor that they put things through to make sure that there's some quality, to make sure that, you know, it's expensive and takes a long time. Like, if it's going to take a long time and be costly, let's at least make it good. Working with Ryan Coogler and the Proximity team was a dream. You know, like, it's Ryan Coogler, man. Like, you know, getting to be on a Zoom with Ryan and talking about Wakanda and Panthers and like, just the way his mind works is remarkable. And, you know, and what his opinions are about that whole world, and just the totality, the depth of his knowledge about it, that we'll never see on the screen, because there's not enough room in 2 hours to reveal everything that dude has thoughts about Wakanda on. But to just get to tap into it a little bit was kind of great. And nobody knows what it is. Like, I've read quite a bit of speculation on the internet about, you know, "Oh, what's this show? It's about X, Y, Z. It's about, I hope this happens." Like, nah, that ain't it. Like, when you get it, it'll be dope. But you all, if you're playing a hot and cold game, you guys are kind of swimming in cold. Because the hot's pretty hot.
I love the mystery. So you throwing me an alley-oop, chilling with Ryan Coogler. obviously you saw Wakanda Forever, and you're the man to ask this question to, because I love the movie, but it left me with more questions than answers. Question: who or whom was the villain in that movie?
Well, it's a weird construction. The villain, I think, at the end of the day, is America. I don't necessarily love the construction of making the movie about. I mean, I get it, but the colonialist imperial machine pitting two brown cultures against each other, kind of for no reason. I get that that's kind of also what it's about, but it didn't feel good to watch. I wish it wasn't that, but I get it, but I wish it wasn't that.
Okay, wow. I think I'm kind of smart, Mark C, because I got the same conclusion. I was thinking the same thing.
Yeah, it's like the West are the villains.
Exactly.
The UN are the villains,
I love that.
The US is the villains, the French are the villains. Basically, the white people here are the bad people here.
Okay, so Mark, tell us about the joys of writing a project about someone as great as Muhammad Ali.
You were asking me before, Mark C, about the how the journalism helps you in the writing, especially of comics or whatever. That was an entirely journalistic enterprise, to the point where it took forever to do, because I spent a year being afraid of it. It's Muhammad Ali, it's maybe the most famous person of the 20th century. The Beatles wanted a picture with him, not the other way around. That's how famous Muhammad Ali was, and so who's had a massive life. There have been full books written on single fights of his. There have been books written on, 2 or 3 year spans of his life, let alone the entirety of it. So how do you wrap your head around all of the things that are Muhammad Ali? And that took me a year to get through. But I finally, I think it's when I went to go see the Steve Jobs movie, the one that Danny Boyle made with Michael Fassbender, that decided, that Aaron Sorkin, who wrote the script, decided we're going to focus on 3 product launches. And each one of those product launches will reveal who Steve Jobs is in that moment in time. And hopefully by being incredibly specific, you can build a picture of the man in the aggregate, right? So I'm okay, I'll do that with Muhammad Ali. I will pick 10 moments of his life and use those to illuminate kind of who he was, sort of impressionistically, right? So it's young Muhammad, and we did it chronologically. We weren't going to screw people over that way as well, but started with him as a kid who gets his bike stolen, then moved on to him as a young fighter in the Olympics, then moved on to him training for Sonny Liston, then move on to him getting diagnosed with Parkinson's, and so forth and so on, and finding these ways to highlight the elements of Ali that I thought were important, him shooting the Esquire magazine cover with all the arrows, the Saint Sebastian thing. I'm let's use that to talk about his conflict with Islam, with at the very least the Nation of Islam. Let's use, and also his relationship to money. Let's use an interview with Howard Cosell to talk about his fame and to talk about the impression that the outside world had about him and his ability to play the media and be funny and be entertaining and engaging, all of that stuff. So it was about finding that information. It was digging through books and watching old newsreels. Thankfully, most of Ali's fights are on YouTube. It's not I wanted to do a Jack Johnson movie and all of that stuff is lost to history. Reading books, watching stuff, just reading magazine articles for people who had spent real time with him. And sadly, we weren't able to finish the book before he passed. But when he passed, that was another floodgate of just people having memories of their time with Ali that we could kind of use and infuse the book with. But it was a daunting task, both for me and for my artist, to realize that there is a responsibility when you're doing the real life story of somebody like that, and to hopefully get more right than we got wrong, but to also take a little bit of license when we could to invent things that didn't happen that felt like they should have happened. There's a chapter in there about it's the Rumble in the Jungle fight. It's him and George Foreman. But I'm listen, if there's any one of his fights you've seen 1,000 times, it's that one. Right. So we're gonna make this chapter instead about a little kid in Zaire who sees him run by on one of his training fights and then is inspired to like, I gotta go see this fight. How am I gonna go see this fight? I'm a little, kid in Zaire who's got no money. I gotta go and see this fight. And his journey towards both A, breaking into that stadium, but also B, feeling that because Ali saw him, he could do anything. The effect that Ali just had on everybody. It's like, that kid didn't exist, that story didn't exist, but like the fiction that's inspired by the fact to kind of embroider a little bit of new out of something that was old. But yeah, like it took us a decade to make that book, but I'm incredibly proud of it.
Let's talk about wokeness in comics. Why is it necessary for people of diverse backgrounds to have their narratives within comics and pop culture? And why is wokeness a negative concept in the comics community these days?
So just a little question then, just a quick one. Listen, I think it is always important for people to have the capacity and the ability to see themselves in the things that they watch or read or listen to or whatever. Comics has historically been a medium created by and ingested by white men. Most of the heroes have been white men. Even the heroes of color that we love have been created by white men. Some of them have been great. Luke Cage is great. T'Challa is great. Aurora Monroe is great. Like, Forge is great. Like, I'm not going to say that work hadn't been done and that bad things have been the totality of what came out of it. That would be a lie. But I think that, as an audience, as that audience grows and broadens, there is always a desire for authenticity in those stories that we're telling. And, God love him, Stan Lee didn't know very much about Africa when he created T'Challa. Jack Kirby didn't know very much about Africa. And so it feels like that when you now go back and read that stuff, you're like, oh, what? Huh? Like, none of this feels specific. None of this feels like it has any, research applied to it. It just feels like the first thought that came into your mind about what this would have been. And it's fallen to other people to pick up that mantle and define it in ways that seem to make sense and add some of that texture and color and specificity to it. When Priest gets involved, when Reggie or Ta-Nehisi gets involved, suddenly you begin to feel like this is a real place that has real people, that has real problems. So I think it's always important to broaden the pool from which we are choosing storytellers to tell stories about people of color. And not just telling stories about people of color, but telling stories about white people too. Because people who have a different experience see the world a different way. And if we would like to not have the same stories all the time, then let's look at the world of the stories we're telling and find new ways into them and new ways to attack them. And so to read Dwayne McDuffie on the Justice League is a different experience because his life led him to different conclusions about the way the world works and the moral values of right and wrong and so forth. Not a black book, probably 2 black characters on it because otherwise DC would have blown their minds and popped a gasket if suddenly it's the Black Justice League. But it moves differently. It has a different energy to it. And I think that is always, always valuable. Any way we can make this stuff come to life in a way that we haven't always been reading it is a valuable path to go down. Why does the comic book industry seem to have a bigger problem with wokeness as it does? Ultimately, people fear change. I think, comics, again, mostly written by and for white guys, who are beginning to die out, to put a not so fine a point on it, that is a generation that feels as if they're taking the world away from us. There's nothing that used to be the way it was. It's yeah, but that's always the way it is. This is just what happens. This is what's called progress. And it's not that you can't enjoy it. You just never had to find a way to empathize with it before. Everybody else, women, people of color, have had to go to movies and TV shows and find ways to empathize with characters who do not look like them and do not operate the way they do. But I'm good with it. I can still watch Raiders of the Lost Ark and vibe with Indiana Jones if you can't watch Blade and vibe with Blade, then that's on you, man. That's not on me. If you can't meet that character where it is and enjoy him for what he is and understand that that's a life experience that's different from yours, but they're all different from yours because that dude's an archaeologist and you live in your house in your mom's basement. That dude is a pilot. You barely drive that car. Like, we are all, finding our way into the heroes' lives. And seeing where our lives are wanting in reflection. That's fine. That's what fiction does. But to suddenly say, I don't want it in my fiction is where the problem lies, And so it is sadly this weird function of the world we live in today, which is more polarized than it's ever been, where people feel as if they are empowered to say the dumb things out loud. And have unfortunately found ways to profit off of selling exclusion as opposed to inclusion. Like, yeah, all right, so Comicsgate, sure, whatever. Like, you guys make your shitty comics that nobody else wants to read anyway. Fine, that's okay. Like, if these comics were good, everybody would be reading them. They're not. So, like, enjoy. Like, I don't want to yuck anybody's yum. Have a blast. But, the world doesn't seem to want you guys to be making the other comic books that everybody's reading or the other movies that everybody's watching. I don't know. I don't know what to tell you. Good luck, I suppose. Go with God.
Yes, go with God. Mark, you're no rookie to the Star Wars franchise, but let's talk about Mace Windu. When you're writing that, how often does the voice of the great Samuel L. Jackson pops up in your mind?
Oh, it's never not in your mind. Like, I remember when they asked me if I was interested in doing Mace Windu. I was like, the beauty of this is that he's barely a character. Like, he's Sam Jackson with a lightsaber and kind of always has been. Even in like Phantom Menace and then Attack of the Clones, like there's like a clippedness to him. Like, he's very rigid in his feelings about things, and he's very kind of curtailed. He keeps his emotions in check, but it's still Sam Jackson. It's always Sam Jackson. So whenever I'm writing a character that currently exists in media, whenever it's a piece of IP, if there's a version of that character that's already in the world, that's the version that's in my head when I'm writing it. Like, he's younger than the Sam Jackson in Phantom Menace. Like, this Mace Windu is like, it's not quite like Mace Year One, but it's like he's passed his trials. He's a Jedi Knight. He's been working for a little bit, but he's definitely not Yoda's right hand yet. This is pre-Clone Wars. This is like, he is still building his resume that he will then use to get the job of, like, the badass at the right hand of the mighty Yoda. So there's some latitude we could take, right? We can add a little bit more swagger in there. We can have him make some mistakes that he would have learned from later on.
So now you're moving on to another medium, video games, with the Black Panther Captain America game. How is writing a script for video games different from writing for TV or comics?
Video games, it's one of those things that, much like comics, when I came to it, I'm like, I've been reading these for years. This is going to be a piece of cake. And then you learn all the ways that it's not a piece of cake. And just figuring out that video games, not only do you have to deliver people a story that they're invested in and that they can follow, and the characters are relevant and emotional, and that the story does all the things you want a story to do, players got to play it. Like, there's got to be room for the player to do things, to give the player the illusion of choice, even though they have no choice. They're going to do what you're telling them to do. You're on rails in the game. You're almost always on rails. Like, there's, unless you're playing Skyrim or Elden Scroll, whatever the hell, that, like, if you could take it 300 hours to finish because you can it's open world for real. Most games are not open world. Amy Hennig, who was the creative director on the game, who did the Uncharted games, understands very well how to create a narrative that gives you the illusion that you have choice in it, but you don't really, and that makes the play time, the play part of it, also part of the story. Like, how you detonate, how you deploy story while you're still engaged in that part of it. And that took a while. That took just conceptually, like, how to understand how those two things had to function hand in hand. Because it's somewhat counterintuitive to every other kind of writing that I've done, where the audience is passive. Like, you decide when they're going to learn this thing. You decide how long their experience is. But in a game, no, that's not at all the case. And also it was a game with multiple characters that the player was going to have some investment in. So not only do you have to have a T'Challa story, no, I'm sorry, a Black Panther story, because it's not T'Challa. It's because it's 1943, and Black Panther gets to punch Nazis. That means that it's T'Challa's grandfather, Tsuzuri. You got to do stuff about him and tell that story and tell the Wakanda side of that story and the Germany side of that story. You've got Steve Rogers, and you've got to tell that side of the story and make sure that all of these things feel like they're heavy enough and they have enough weight, and that the audience that's coming to it will get what they thought they were going to get out of it. And luckily with this one, it was, can Black Panther punch Nazis a lot? We're like, yeah, he can. We've seen Steve Rogers punch a lot of Nazis, but now he gets to do it too, and you get to do it as you're playing the Black Panther. And I played an early an early build of the engine, and it's that is a ton of fun, man. Just punching Nazis a lot remains joyous. Never not a good time.
Wrapping things up, Mark, can you tell us which one of your works affected you the most emotionally, whether it was in the process or response from critics?
I've been lucky in that critics have not been too hard on the work. There've been, books that some people liked and some people didn't. That's always par for the course. And over time, I would learn to not engage very much with those reviews. I remember when The Highwayman came out, I was just Google searching every day. Is there a new review? And then over time, it's it's diminishing returns the more you do that. Adora and the Distance is a very emotional book for me because it's very much inspired by my experiences having an autistic child. So there's always emotion tied up in that, for me. Whether it's the writing and the production of that book, whether it was the release of that book, it's always somewhat fraught in great ways. But it's definitely an emotional work. I'm not going to say it's a weird one. The one I didn't expect to be emotional about was Genius. Which I still love. I love that character, Destiny Ajayi, who is the greatest military mind of her generation and who secedes 3 square blocks from South Central and calls it its own nation, and she holds it through force. But when I remember there was some sniper in Texas or something like that who was shooting cops from the tops of buildings, and I'm like, that's how our book opens. When the real world suddenly crashes into the fake world you made up. When Ferguson blew up and the militarized police are rolling, through the streets. I'm like, there's a couple of spreads in this book that is that. That is the LAPD SWAT unit, just rolling through neighborhoods, with tanks who shouldn't have tanks because they're just cops. But it's the problem with speculative fiction is that sometimes it comes true. And then you find yourself in the weird position of did I do that? I didn't do that. But did I, what? Huh? Why? It doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel good to see the horror that you made up somehow appear in the real world.
Is it a guilt feeling? What is that feeling like when you see it? It's happened in real life.
Yeah, I think I remember writing about it for the LA Times when it happened. There is a guilt. There is a feeling of responsibility. There's a feeling of culpability, which I know to not be true, but it doesn't matter. Once you see the thing that looks like the thing you first saw in your head, 10 years ago, it's very hard to separate the two emotionally. And it was a trip to kind of just spend a day living in that headspace of did we do that? Did somebody read our book and decide that we should do this? It's probably not, because nobody bought that book. But still.
Last question, Mark. I know you're involved with some exciting things, but is there something that we haven't discussed that you want the Stash fam to know about?
Something we haven't discussed that I'm able to talk about.
That you're able to talk about.
Because there is a host. Well, you know what?
Distillery?
I wrote Distillery has been a blast. I'm writing a 3-issue book for them that will hopefully be out by fourth quarter of this year. I'm in the middle of writing it now, and I'm having a blast doing it. But I wrote an episode of Batman Caped Crusader for Ed Brubaker and Bruce Timm, which was bananas. Animation. It's Bruce Timm's return to Batman after the Batman the Animated Series that he's doing on Amazon, I think. Warner Brothers producing. Amazon is going to air it. I'm not sure when it's coming out.
That's not a rumor?
No, not at all. 100% real. I had never gotten to write Batman before, but for my first time writing Batman, to be getting notes from Bruce Timm on how to write Batman was bananas. Like, because I saw the 89 Batman. I love Dark Knight Returns, but like Batman the Animated Series is my Batman. Like Kevin Conroy is my Batman. And so for that dude to be like, oh, that was good. Oh, this doesn't work, but what if you tried this? Okay. And he would do his notes in like red magic marker in the margins of the script, and half the time there'd be little drawings in there too, because he'd just be doodling when he's reading. I'm like, oh, can I have that script, please? I need to have this script because I need my original Bruce Timm doodles on the script that I wrote. Yeah, it was that was every now and again there's one of those like just surreal, how did this get to be my life moments? And like, you know, Bruce Timm and Ed Brubaker giving me notes on a Batman script was kind of ridiculous.
My mind is blown. I was stuttering crazy. It's not a rumor. Marc is working with Bruce Timm and Ed Brubaker. I can't wait. Marc, thank you for joining us, man. This has been a bucket list interview. I had a great time. Thank you for joining us. We would love to have you back again. You always have a home here on the Sig Slayers station. Well, that's all for our show. If you like what you see, please subscribe and hit the like button. This is Sig Slayers. I'm Mike, speaking for Marc and Marc Bernardin. We are out. Peace.
Sig Slayers.